Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's nonprofit navigation series. Looks like we have a big crowd. People are still coming in, but we probably want to get started just to give everybody a chance to get out on time. Just a reminder: we're planning to do this session will take up to 90 minutes. So, but of course, if you need to check out early, you are welcome to do so. So first of all, I'll introduce myself. My name is Tom Van Sage, and I have the privilege of serving as an assistant professor of nonprofit leadership at William Jewell College in Liberty. I do a lot of other things like work with the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership and have greatly enjoyed and really it was an impactful part of my life to teach the fundraising series over the last decade or so, which is being morphed into its kind of new iteration. And I know Scott Helm will be joining soon to talk about that. So this morning, we're basically doing a panel that we have done in several of my fundraising classes at UMKC and at William Jewell that I think is probably more important and more relevant now than ever. And I think that for me, it's absolutely critical as a white cisgender male to really kind of be a part of and facilitate the conversation. I just want to own that up front. I mean, I'm obviously, one of the most privileged part of our community and our society. And I think it's important to just own that up front and say that I've tried to make this a deliberate part of my courses and what I offer to my students. And so it's important for me to, it was great to have this opportunity to bring this to a broader community in Kansas City. And so what I'm going to do, we have an incredible panel that I will introduce in a moment who will really speak to this in a much better way than I will. But as an academic, I just wanted to start the conversation by sharing just some research and some information that's out there related to really just people of color and giving and kind of what that's looking like today, especially in the post George Floyd world that we're living in. And this conversation is just on everybody's mind, and obviously something that I think every nonprofit that I work with and I encounter is working and focused on diversity, inclusion, equity in one way or the other. So I'll just throw out my sources just so you know that this is work that I'm borrowing from others. But to start with, I think just important to set the stage that in 2021, we still live in a very white-dominated world. Whites lead 9.5 out of 10 philanthropic organizations, either at the board or staff level. Only 7% of nonprofit CEOs are people of color. But what's striking about all of this is that while nonprofits are still led by whites, 60% are serving people of color. And so this idea that the people leading and working in organizations reflect the communities that they serve is still obviously a work in progress and the focus of what we'll be talking about today. So to continue that theme and sharing some statistics, when we think about nonprofit boards of directors, only about 8% of nonprofit board members are considered minorities, people of color, BIPOC, LGBTQ. 30% of boards lack even a single person of color. And so I think these are just really, again, it's 2021. We're still just kind of coming out of a period where we're just not seeing a lot of movement, even though this is a major priority and a major focus of a lot of nonprofits. And again, I mean, 63% of organizations say, and probably even higher as we've gotten further from 2020, 63% of organizations say that diversity is a priority and it's a core value. It's something that they value. And again, as this has been measured over the last 18 to 20 years, we know that's just not changing. The needle's not moving. And so again, we really want to take time to talk about that and to hear from people who work in this space all the time. So a little bit more before we head into the discussion. One of my favorite books, and I teach a class at William Jewell on identity, and my students talk about what does it mean to be a person of color, what does it mean to be a white person, and use Robin DiAngelo's 2018 book, White Fragility. I know she was a guest speaker at UMKC in the last couple of years, but I mean, just to kind of highlight some of what she really talks about, and the theme of white fragility is that, reinforcing the statistics that I just shared, that white people are in control of our institutions in our society. They set policy, they're in charge of our government, they're in charge of the corporations, they're in charge of pretty much all of the major sources of control and authority in society. And this is a chart from her book that really, and this is a couple of years old, 2018. Keep in mind that we do have a new president and vice president who I know are more focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I mean, the current U.S. presidential cabinet was 91% white under President Trump. It's certainly different today, but nevertheless, you can still see. I mean, even I like to look at this lower one with teachers and full-time college professors. I know as a professor at Jewel, we have a lot of work to do, and Dr. Rodney Smith, a dear friend of mine, he's our new vice president of equity and inclusion, to really help us work through that. But recruiting college professors of color is a challenge, and it's obviously only 84%. I mean, only 16% of college professors are people of color. And so you can just see, I mean, what's striking is just the books that we read, the news that we watch, the music that's produced. It's just really dominated by a very white oriented culture, white culture, which obviously is, reflects the history of this country, but yet how much more work we really need to do. So let's transition. The focus of today is really talking about fundraising and the space of revenue generation, sustainability for nonprofits. And I think, I'd like to dispel a myth that, and many of you probably are already well aware of this, but donors of color have access to wealth. And this is something that I think many people in the fundraising profession may overlook. So 2,287,217 is the number of African-American, Hispanic, and Asian households with a net worth of $250,000 to $10 million. Over 2.2 million people in this country that are considered, people of color, African-American, Hispanic, and Asians who we would really call high net worth donors, high net worth individuals. And so that's a number that I want you to think about, and hopefully that resonates, that this is a population that we ought to be focused on. We really need to have on our radar screens for a lot of reasons, but just for the fact that they do have means, they do have wealth. So we know that whites in general account for 3/4 of donors. And at this point, 60% of the population is white. We know that by 2040, that will be under 50% of the population. So the demographics are changing, and I think it's important for nonprofits to embrace that and to really begin planning for the future where whites are no longer the majority in this country. So I really like this chart from the Chronicle of Philanthropy that really kind of echoes this idea that people of color are not only people that have access to wealth, but are more generous than whites. And I think especially looking at the graph on the right, where 91.6% of African Americans give to nonprofits. I mean, that's a staggering amount, almost 100%. And of course, that's close with whites, 89.8, followed by Hispanics, and then finally Asian Americans. So I just think in terms of really looking at people of color as not just people that have access to wealth, but people who are generous, people who are philanthropic, who really feel like giving back to their communities is a part of what they ought to be doing. So again, reflecting the theme of the 2.2 million people in this country who are who have access to wealth, but are also people of color. 14% of all millionaires are people of color, and this number will likely continue to grow as people continue to gain education, gain access to opportunities, I think that's only going to continue to grow over in the coming years. Again, why do we even need to have this conversation? But again, this is an area that maybe hasn't been talked about. Certainly the access to publications on this have just ballooned over the last couple of years since May and June of 2020, when we had our record breaking protest, the biggest civil protest in this country in our history. Obviously, there's a lot more attention focused on this area. And I think fundraising professionals can get frustrated that they feel like, well, we're trying, we're just not breaking into communities of color. They don't seem interested. They don't necessarily like our cause. And I think that's going to be a big focus of our panel discussion. I mean, how do we connect with, how do we build trust with these communities? And I think it really comes down to, how does your nonprofit reflect the people that you hope to invite into your donor family? And do the fundraising professionals look like the community that you're talking to? Does your board, does your staff? How do you really authentically reflect that those priorities? And I think that's where I think the real work is, and I think how we all need to kind of get into the right frame of mind for long-term growth in this area. What's also interesting is that, again, looking at some research, most people of color also talk a lot about how, when we look at 91.6% of Blacks who are giving to nonprofits or giving to charities, a lot of it is just giving to their own family members and friends. And I think this is just kind of interesting that multiple donors told researchers they gave nearly $500,000 a year towards rent, medical expenses, or tuition for family members. And so I think that's that's probably not unique among people of color. It's certainly something the white community does as well, but it seems to be a higher focus for these communities. So it's just something to be aware of. And I think, just to kind of put a pin in, so why might we assume that people of color aren't going to be wealthy? They're not people that we normally traditionally would talk to. This is a myth that that there's that there aren't many people of color who are wealthy, and I think that's sort of reflected in the general population, where the median family wealth for whites is $888,000 a year, compared with the median income of Black families, which is about $24,000. And so that's certainly a stark, we talk about the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, but I think this is a myth, though, that just because of that, I mean, somebody with a $24,000 income could be giving just as much of a percentage of their income away to nonprofits and charities that very wealthy families that do. And I think that's borne out in the statistics, and something, again, that, even if we're not just talking about the wealthiest Americans, that even people in the zip codes in our community in Kansas City that we think of as impoverished, the giving rates there are in some ways higher than in other communities like Mission Hills. So I really think this is an interesting, again, kind of dispelling myths, an interesting quote by Michelle Singletary, that Black donors don't just give to the church. Their largesse generally falls into three categories: CornerStone, which is giving to higher education and the arts; kinship, donating to organizations serving the Black community; and sanctified, supporting Black churches. And so I think, I know that our panel will be speaking to, groups, communities beyond just the Black community, but certainly there is a myth that, well, Black donors are only really most interested in their churches. And while that's true, there are certainly lots of other ways that that Black donors are making contributions to the larger philanthropic community. So nearly 2/3 of Black households donate to community-based organizations and causes to the tune of about $11 billion a year. So I think that just speaks to, again, dispelling the myth that it's only going to churches. And again, Black families, Black households are giving away a quarter more of their incomes than white families. And so these are just things that are truth. And I think we all need to understand that, and also talk about, why it's important to obviously diversify our donor base. It's the right thing to do. but also how do we do it? How do we make that happen? And so with that, I am really, really pleased and honored to, first of all, give honor and recognition to our panelists. These are people who have, I see some of my former students on today's seminar. They've been a part of this Color of Money, Advancing Diversity and Inclusion discussion in classes that I've taught over the years. And many of these folks that I'll introduce now have been on this journey with me for 5 years or so. So first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce Tahir Atwater, who is with CASA Jackson County. He's the Director of Donor and Volunteer Engagement. Rosisella Blakney, who is the Scholarship Supervisor at the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation. Nicole Jacobs-Silvey, who has been with me on this one from the beginning. She's the president and founder of Connection Coach KC. Randy Lopez, vice president of the Wyandotte Health Foundation. And finally, Latasha Wilson, who is the founder of CornerStone Enterprise. So these are my friends. Many of them, it's funny, as I look at this list, were students in classes. And so it's just kind of how I sort of evolve with as a teacher, and it's part of what I love about teaching, is just to be able to build these long-term relationships and then bring students into situations like this where they can become the teachers. So I want to maybe just start by asking any of our panelists to just make any comments about the slides that I just showed. I mean, anything that you want to disagree with or maybe elaborate on. Many of them, this is the first time they've seen these. I've not presented the slides in conjunction with this discussion before. We usually just jump right into the discussion. So any of the panelists want to comment on what I just shared?
Hey, Tom, I'll jump in.
Thanks.
So good morning, everybody. One of the stats that struck a chord with me, I think there was one that said 30% of boards lack a single person of color. And to your point, Tom, as these conversations continue to become more prevalent and more of a priority, I think we'll see the way that we measure success start to change, because I don't know that a single person of color should be the mark. Well, I know it shouldn't be, right? I think that's what leads to tokenism. So as low as that might be now, that it's 30% of boards lack a single person of color, if we change that metric to what percentage of boards have more than one person of color, then you're going to really start to tell the story, right? Because along with that comes retention of board members. And why is it so difficult to find a person of color? Well, because you've only got one person, and people are typically recruiting board members through who their other board members know. So I think metrics like that we'll start to see redefined over time.
Yeah, I mean, great point. Just because you have a person of color or multiple, I mean, it's how are they contributing? How are they enriching the board? I mean, yeah, I think really asking questions like, how do we know this is making a difference? How do we know that a diverse board is really better serving our clients, better serving our mission? Any other general comments? Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks to hear. This is Randy Lopez. So I'll just add to that. I think that's a great point. And to add to that, to say, what's the pipeline of leadership on the board? What does that look like in an organization I'm a part of? We were recently just having that conversation about how do we ensure that we are asking all of our board members, but especially our board members of color, to be a part of that leadership on the board and building that pipeline so that they feel that that they have a commitment and a responsibility, and we do as well as an organization, to make sure that we are building that pipeline for our leaders of color on our board to then take on, chairs of a committee or to become the board chair or the board vice chair. And we have to sometimes be very intentional about how we approach that and making sure that that's happening. I see my friend Irene Caudillo here, and that's something that we've had conversations, and then I'm borrowing from her, because she that's something she says a lot, is that we have to be very intentional about making sure that we're building that pipeline for our board members of color to not only be on the board, but making sure that they're contributing and taking on those leadership positions.
Great. And I should add, I think we're just going to be wide open for questions or comments from anybody. You're welcome to interrupt. We also have Cindy Laufer, who is monitoring the chat, if you want to send questions via chat. So this should be very interactive. Other just general comments, reactions from any of the panelists. Latasha, Nicole, Rosisella.
Tom, I'll jump in. I'm so glad to be here again. Thank you, Midwest Center, for broadening out this conversation to a larger audience. And it's an honor to have Tom invite us back again. I think this might be 9th year, Tom. I'm missing out, but counting, but it's unbelievable. And I learn as much each time as I hopefully can offer to the group. But there's so many things that I could echo, especially with Tahir and Randy. And what really comes to mind is I know in our sector, this has been the intention, right? I've heard us talk about diversifying boards. This is nothing new. I'm of that age that I've been in the not-for-profit sector, had been before starting my business for over 20 years. And we've talked about this, but how do we take that intention to action is where we had always fallen short. And while this topic has always been timely, you said it, there's a sense of urgency. And what I've seen is where there's a plan, where there's a strategy, what gets measured and what has money and resources put to it is what actually is accomplished. We know that across all the work that we do, and it's no different with board diversity. And so it's with intentionality and networking. I say this every panel, we still largely live in segregated communities. It's an unfortunate reality. And so unless we go out of our original communities that we're in day to day, we may not meet candidates that are from diverse backgrounds. And we often use the compass of who do we know. That's how we determine who sits on boards. And if we continue to do that, that's when we come up with, well, I don't know anyone, and we see people shrug their shoulders. And so it comes with relationship building and trust, as you mentioned earlier at the top of the show.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
No, is this a show?
Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, event. Yes, we're making your show.
That's awesome. Welcome to the show. Okay, great. Nicole, great points. And I'll just reiterate I facilitated a strategic planning retreat for a nonprofit on Saturday who has intentionally diversified its board, and the conversation around what their goals will be was radically different than what it would have been had people of color not been in the room. And it was just incredible because I was like, this is what the strategic planning process should look like when you diversify a board and you're talking about intentionally building trust in communities of color east of Troost, and how to do that. And it was just amazing to me because I was like, this is what I think it should look like. And so I appreciate the connection between strategic planning and then just putting a statement on your website that says, we are all about DEI. That's great, but where does the rubber hits the road is really, I think, what it needs to come down to. Latasha, Rosisella, any other comments from?
Yeah, I always feel like we're just always piggybacking on each other's comments every time we've had these discussions. I'm really grateful again to be here. And as a fellow UMKC alumni, it's always glad to be back. One thing that I believe Randy said it, and so did Tahir, is there, when you look at like, okay, there might be 1 or 2 people that are sitting on boards, but oftentimes what happens is that there's this assumption that there's like scarcity in talent or it's in leadership roles, especially with people of color. And then those same like 2 people are on every board or on every panel. And I think that happens often, that there's, the voices that are rising to the top just kind of continue to be the only voices that you hear. And so then it becomes also a monolith of, oh, well, the representative for the, Latinx community is this person because that is the only person that you see. And so then you don't realize that there is like such a large community that is, continuing to, has so much more to offer. And I think that we need to be willing, I don't want to say take a risk, I don't know if that's the right word, but like willing to expand beyond the 5 or 10 people that kind of get pulled for everything, because that happens often, especially in Kansas City. I've worked in nonprofit for many years, and you always see the same names. And I think that we just need to be willing to expand beyond that.
Great point. And I know there's research out there. I didn't include that in the PowerPoint, but oftentimes when we're hiring fundraisers, we have an urgent need to hire somebody who has a proven track record, who has raised a bunch of money for the nonprofits, and they tend to be people with experience, people who are white, and nonprofits will go to those people because people of color haven't had the experience. And so I think there's a real effort, I think, in terms of taking a chance. It's taking a chance on board members, but also potential staff members who just need an opportunity to learn and grow. So it looks like Cheryl Francis, you have your hand up. So proceed.
It's Gloria Fisher. Oh, I don't know why it says Cheryl Francis.
You
That's
said
weird.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry, Gloria.
it's Gloria Fisher. It's Gloria Fisher, and I think I know you from William Jewell with my good friend Lori Wetmore. Anyway, all to say, besides Nonprofit Connect, is there a place where we could that has a bank of people who'd like to serve on boards and yeah, people who'd like to serve on boards and good minority candidates is really what I'm looking for. As well as young candidates, because I think we do need to start looking at, like Randy said, the pipeline of who's on our board and who are the next leaders to take the reins.
Yeah, thanks, Gloria. Great question. Who wants to answer that?
I guess I can. Oh, go ahead, Tahir.
Go ahead.
I think we might be sharing some of the same. There's some things in the pipeline. I'm a part of a grant that's with the Support Kansas City that I know Irene is a part of, and there's other champions on this call. It's called the Greater Kansas City Board Diversity Initiative, funded by the Hall Family Foundation as well as Kansas Health Foundation. We're in the pilot stages, but what we're essentially crafting will be a pipeline of candidates that are board ready, in addition to training for boards to become more inclusive and to have shared power. So there'll be these two tracks, and Tom's working on that with us as well. So that's one avenue that's going to be building a pipeline. I don't know how the bank will look, so that's still to come, Gloria. And I don't know if Tahir, if you're able to speak about the other KC Rising. So.
Sure. Yes, the KC Rising is in the midst of kind of finalizing a new platform, like a digital platform. A talent bank, retention bank, whatever you want to call it, for not just boards, but just employment in general. But I think even beyond that, I mean, you look at Nonprofit Connect, you look at these large hubs of companies, but I would say look to the racially diverse chambers, look to the Heartland Black Chamber, the Hispanic Chamber, right? Not just to their membership, but look to, they often have young professional groups. Or you look to some of the large employers in Kansas City or in the region. Many of them have employee resource groups that are specific to like racial diversity, right? Gender diversity, sexual orientation. Instead of going to the top HR office or leader at these large organizations, try to drill down to those employee resource groups and say, hey, we'd like to come talk to your group or just talk to your leadership. You know, so sometimes we go straight to these giant hubs, and sometimes the resources are right there. The people on your board represent sometimes these large organizations. Go straight to their employee resource groups. You can find a wealth of diverse talent there.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
And Gloria, I see in the chat two other comments. I saw Colette Black talked about the Urban League. It looks like has a bank as well. And then yes. I saw Rachel Russell chimed in and mentioned United We's appointments project. And so I'm not sure how United We, how you access that information, but you would check out both of those as well. And if I missed anything else in the chat, please chime in. The last comment I'll mention, I heard you say something, Gloria, that is so common. I hear people say, you know, the good candidates of color, the good from younger generations. And I really encourage you and push to think about transferable skills. And that when someone says to me, who is a potential board candidate, there's an internal list of competencies that I think of for people to serve on boards, and that those individuals have those competencies in their day-to-day work lives, that even if they haven't served on a board, those transfer quite easily to board engagement. It's that dedication to the mission and those things. So if we, those things, those individuals are a plethora out there. It's just tapping into those communities by building relationships in sincere and authentic ways. So thank you for that question. I know others had the same.
Yeah, and that, you know, we do a board analysis. I'm sorry, we do a board analysis, what talents we're looking for and what's missing in the board and what talents are missing. But we're really very aware that I think the youngest member on our board is 40. And so, and really there's only one person at 40. Most of them are 55 and older. So we really see the board aging, and we need to get some young blood in there. And really, when we talk about equity, we got to say equity is not just color. Equity is not just color. That has many other aspects that we got to look at. So that's what we just want to really focus on, trying to get the new candidates in that will fill some of the professional skills we want, as well as some equity ticks that we'd like to, start to address. Thank you.
Go ahead, Cindy. I think you had a question.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about this, so this makes a question about give and get and how that can be kind of restrictive at times for people. And so it sort of, especially with younger people, was what the comment was about. But any comments on that, like how that can sort of sway who might be able to be on the board?
So we're not doing an age restriction. We just know that we'd like to invite several people, like say under 30, with different skill sets. So it's not like we wouldn't accept somebody that would be older. I mean, we're looking for good candidates, but if you're going to try to build a pipeline, at some point in time, you have to have some younger members on the board. And there is an equity issue with hearing from the youngers, especially we did one of the things that we did that started this is the people that we are serving are 60% are 34 to 40, I think 34 to 45 or 35 to 45. And so then you kind of say, you really need the voice of 35 to 45 in there if 60% of the people that the clients we're serving are that age.
Tom, can I jump in here for a second?
Sure, yeah, Latasha.
I had a couple of comments, but the first one is related just to ask Gloria's question. One of your probably most effective board members could be those folks that you serve. And so you understand the population. It sounds as if you do understand the population that you serve, particularly if there's folks that have been with you for years, or maybe they, benefited from your organization. And then now, you should ask them to come and consider, particularly
Gotcha.
those that have, truly, had some level of success. Their life has been changed because of the work that you've done. And those are the folks that's going to bring a level of insight and understanding really what the work is and what is needed. Then it will be very difficult to find that in just someone, even if it's just a friend of yours.
Right.
So I would
Gotcha.
say we'll start there.
Good idea. Very good idea. Good idea.
And then I'll just share a little bit about my own personal journey of coming on a board, right? So the things that Tom mentioned in the opening of this event, these are big issues. I mean, these are just like, these are institutional societal issues that's been built over centuries, right? And so, we definitely are not where we need to be. But we also want to make sure that we understand that each of us represents some level of a nonprofit that's doing work. So there's a level and a heart here that we don't want to discount, right? So when I got into the nonprofit world, I was at Sprint. I had the privilege, and the only way I can say this is through access, right? I had access to senior level executives that are, people of color. Some were people of color and some were not, but they gave me access into knowledge, understanding, information, rooms that I never would have. And one was a senior executive that recommended that I meet with a president of a board for a nonprofit, that I ended up coming onto that board, and as a board member, then as a treasurer, then as a vice chairman, and then as a chairman. And the reason why I wanted to be a part of that nonprofit is because they served me. They served the community I came from. And that is what resonated with me. I had a heart to give what I had been given, right? And when I got on that board, of course, I had never had that experience. I didn't have someone teaching me all the skills that Nicole was talking about, this group that they are putting together so that folks are board ready. I had to learn on my own. I took a class at Kaufman on how to be an effective board member, right? What are the things? So I had my intellect, I had my background, but I didn't have the level of understanding I needed in order to be effective, right? And so, I think that is very crucial, because when you do give once you are given access, you know, that's the thing you can't take lightly. And because there's others behind you that will be impacted if you don't come to the table ready, right? And so I would say that there's a lot to be done as it relates to those stats. And, you know, I like to be informed of them, but I can't let them discourage me and take away my ability and my power to understand that each of us on this call have power to make impact and to change every single one of those stats. We're doing it right now, right? One of the other things I would just ask is that, you know, we understand that as we begin to step into these rooms, whether you're a person of color or you are not, and you are locking arms with a person of color in order to reverse and change some of those stats, that we come with a heart of humility, that we really do come with the ability to be able to listen, you know, not just to be heard, but to hear. And that we understand that it's going to take some time, right? And we have to have some patience. And so those are just some of the things that as we begin to move and to change some of the things that are happening today, that we really understand that it's a work that we do together. I think there's an openness of the heart that's happening right now that I want to make sure that we stay in that same vein in order to be able to rise together in having this level of impact that we are wanting it to have. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to share.
That was very, very well said, Latasha. Thank you. And there's, I mean, we could just go down. You said so many things that I think are so important. So I do see we have Marquita Taylor who has their hand up. So if you would like to go next with your question.
I really appreciate an opportunity to speak because this is a topic that's so near and dear to my heart. After so many years in the nonprofit arena and serving as development director, one of the things that I try to do, I don't care where I am, but if I see a nonprofit professional of color anywhere in the room, I make a beeline over there to them to encourage them, to bring them forward. Let's have coffee, let's build, let's grow, because it's an institutional problem that we have. There are a number of minorities who serve on boards. And yes, it's usually the same ones on 4 or 5 or 6 different boards, which I'm glad to hear Nicole and others are working on growing that pipeline. But there are a number of development professionals who have quit the industry because they can't get any further. They can work behind the scenes. They can do the database. They can possibly maybe go on a call. But to actually be hired and receive that title and be out in the public eye is still a challenge. And I think the only way to get around that or to get past that is for those executive directors of those organizations that make that call. They certainly look for the experience. They look for people who may be known in the community, but they tend to bypass the skills they may have on their own staff. And they tend to and think that the donors will only look for people that look like themselves to give money to. I mean, this is something that I've seen through the years, and I would love to see Nonprofit Connect, and they do great work. I would love to see a number of other organizations just say, okay, we got to stop this. Let's see what we can do with those executive directors to help them broaden their minds on what's really out here and who are we really supporting. The majority of the people that we're supporting are the people who are in our communities. What would that look like if we just allow the minorities to minority development directors to go into the community of the people that they serve, and for those funders to go with us into the communities that we serve, opposed to thinking that they have to look different. And it's just across the board. And I hate seeing so many talented development professionals feeling like there's nothing I can do, I can't advance. And the few of us who stand out, you know, that are out here, Colette Black's been doing this for years, who are out here trying to be this champion. But it took an organization that understood that we have the skills just like our counterparts. We have the ability if given the opportunity. So thank you for allowing me to share that. And thank you for this forum, because it brings it back and gives us an opportunity to talk about it.
Marquita, thank you for your comments. And I want to put a punctuation mark on what she said. And I mean, I think it's not people of color's job to solve this problem. I mean, white men, white women, I mean, we all need to be that person that makes a beeline over to people, young professionals, to help them. I loved what Latasha said about she was given access to rooms and tables that she never would have. And so I think based on the statistics, we know that you know, it's still a white dominated culture. It is here in Kansas City, and it's whites, I think especially, need to make this effort, and we need to do more. And so I say that as a white guy. So and shout out to my good friend Colette. She is awesome, and she has been doing this work forever. So so fantastic conversation. Let me just we have a bunch of questions that, and feel free to jump in, anybody. The question I have is to the panel: what would you say to nonprofits that are really trying to break into fundraising and building better relationships with communities of color? I mean, what advice do you have for people on today looking for that kind of basic information?
Tom, I'll jump in on, it kind of piggybacks on what you just said, but also a slide that you had said something about donors of color don't seem interested. That's what some organizations can think. And I almost flipped it around to, but are those donors interested in the individuals they're trying to recruit? Are they truly interested in the communities of color? That's what I really heard. And so all of us, regardless of our identity, know what it's like when people reach out to us in a sincere and authentic way and when they don't. And communities of color are no different. So what has happened is there's a increased emphasis or focus on communities of color, there's a sense of urgency, and we know relationships happen over time. I'm often asked, how did I build my network? How did I meet this person or that? And I just say one relationship at a time. And also relationships are best made when they're just made authentically and then they're tapped into later, not built with an intention in mind. So when someone is looking to donate to organizations, it's beyond just being interested in the mission. It's seeing if they're going to be valued. We have more things that are on our time in terms of volunteers. There's more, as we said, there's more giving power within communities of color than people often think. Well, there's many opportunities and options. And so with that, people are vetting and seeing what organizations are really walking the talk. And what I see not-for-profit organizations being called to do is look at differently. The board table is where two P's come to play: power and privilege. And so while we talk about white community, it's really even upper middle class and affluent, if we really speak about that. Blue collar and even lower middle class white folks, they're not engaged in this conversation in the same ways either. So when we look at the face of philanthropy, we have to look at how giving looks in a variety of communities and what has value. And that people can give, whether, like Latasha said, it's someone who is a former recipient of services, if it's someone who's a parent of a student in a school, we look at a very narrow window of who has privilege and power and the ability to give at the board table. And when we blow that up and we look at those systems of oppression, that's when we really see and make the difference when we do that anti-racism work. So when Marquita said, and Latasha and several others said that the same people get asked to serve on boards, I know Tahir and I talked about this, it's because those individuals of color are closer to the power and the privilege circle, right? So they usually are college educated, upper middle class or affluent, and they have access because of their privilege. And so when we broaden that out, it looks much different. So we have to do some structural differences. So going back to the original, what you said, what can organizations do? Take an audit. Look internally first before you reach out and see where you have blind spots, and see within your own organization, do you have 2% people of color within your organization, but they're all in entry-level positions? Where are you engaging thought leadership and vision and innovation across all areas of diversity? And as Gloria said, it's not just culture, all the areas. And so that's what I think, start at home, start looking at your organization, and then start with building relationships, not going with the ask, but going with the, let me learn about you.
Yeah, I'll jump in as well. Thank you, Nicole, for that. I think I completely agree. Two things I wanted to share. One that Marquita touched on, and I think kind of at the fundamental level that everyone's touched on, and I've shared this before, Tom and Nicole. You've heard me talk about how philanthropy, right, plays a huge role in this, how funders play to perpetuate some of those systemic issues that Marquita, Latasha, and others have touched on. And I think philanthropy is trying to do better, but it's slow and it's painful. But I think we have to keep pushing. Oftentimes, and if you're in a nonprofit, if you worked in a nonprofit, you're trying to ask money from foundations. Every foundation is a little bit different, and every foundation asks you for different things. And if you don't put the right punctuation in the right place, you might be automatically disqualified from that grant cycle. Or if you don't have the right 990 form, or you don't have an audit, maybe, then you may not qualify for that grant. So I think we as philanthropy have to do a better job of what Nicole said, right? Doing that internal assessment and looking at our processes to make sure that we're being equitable and how we look to distribute money. Organizations who have a $10 million budget versus an organization who's a more grassroots, maybe a startup who may not have the staff to have a development director or a communications director. Maybe it's the executive director doing all three of those jobs. How is philanthropy, how are we as foundations supporting and helping to build that capacity of those smaller nonprofits or organizations who are truly embedded in community, who are truly serving, who may be Black or Brown led organizations? What are we doing as foundations to help support and build that capacity and being more equitable in our processes? And so I think, to Nicole's point, that's something that we have to do a better job of internalizing, looking at and assessing our processes on how are we making sure we're being equitable in our decision making, and we're not there yet, to be honest, right? I think foundations are struggle, and part of it is that power and that historical systemic approach that we've taken. But I think we're trying, at least at our foundation, I think, and we are looking at that, and I know others are too. So I did want to just touch on that, Marquita. Thank you for bringing that up, because I think it doesn't always fall on the nonprofit. It shouldn't fall on the nonprofit. I think we as philanthropy need to be more nimble, more flexible, more equitable in our processes. The second point, Tom, to what you were touching on in terms of how we build on communities of color and work with them. I'm going to give an example, and I think I forget who said. I think everyone's kind of talked about it. Latasha talked about being authentically present and listening and hearing and engaging, and it takes time to build relationship and trust, right? You can't just assume that once you go into a community and you're there, that you're going to build that trust right away. I mean, you have to be consistent and be authentically present when you're trying to build those relationships. An example I'll give is with an organization I'm a part of with the Hispanic Development Fund. And the work that HDF does to build trust and relationships in the Latino and the overall community. But we started. I say we. I'm on the advisory board there. We started this initiative called Cambio para Cambio. It's to support our scholarship program that we have in for graduating or current college students in the Kansas City metro area. Back in 2017, we started these champions of Cambio para Cambio, where I think it was 10 champions to help raise money for the scholarship program. And back in 2017, I think we raised maybe around $5,000. And it was these champions who went out and tried to and spoke about and advocated for the Latino community and scholarships, why this was important. You fast forward that to last year, in just a matter of 4 years, we went from raising $5,000 to raising $240,000 from that Cambio initiative, which is a month-long process, right? It's during Hispanic Heritage Month. And it really, I'll tell you what worked or why it worked is we didn't, we as the organization, yes, we championed it, yes, we lifted it, but we also shared that responsibility with community. We brought in former scholars, we brought in community members, we brought in school teams to help us share the message of why it's important to give to our own community, to this community to build up scholarships. And it has been one of the most successful fundraising initiatives that HDF has had, but just community relationship building. We bring these teams together, we bring these champions together to talk about their experiences, to share why this is important for them to give, to talk about why they want to be a part of this initiative, why this is important to them. And so I think going back to having those authentic conversations about the importance of giving, relationship building, trust building, and being present makes a huge difference. And so this year we've kicked off the Cambio campaign. We have over 30 champions that are a part of that. And we're looking to surpass what we built last year. But again, it's not because the organization is doing all the work. It's because we've brought in and we're engaging our community that we serve to make sure that they feel that they are a part of the work that's happening. And so I think that's an important piece as well.
Randy, you went from 5,000 to what? 200,000 plus?
240,000 in 4 years. Yes, sir.
Wish you had a mic that you could just drop, just I saw many eyebrows, including mine, go, whoop. It's like, okay. Right. So thank you for including that. It's just good to hear those numbers because people need to hear. It's not shallow, but people do need to hear that number attached to DEI and strategy and what it can bring. So I just wanted to celebrate you, Randy. Good job, man.
I celebrate community because they're the ones that did the work, right? It's our community, it's our parents, it's our grandparents who gave $5, $10, whatever amount they could. And that's the other piece, right? It's oftentimes when we think about giving, and a misconception of giving, Tom, you touched on it, is that we don't go to communities of color because they're not high net worth donors. And that's A, that's not true. And B, you're minimizing the power of that philanthropic spirit within these communities of color, within the Black and Brown community. And so a lot of times if we pull the data, we would see that a lot of these folks that gave, that donated money, I mean, there were sums of, I can go on the donor page now and I see $5, $20, $50, $10. And it's that power of the collective community coming together to support and celebrate each other, like you said, Tahir.
And I just want to add on to that, Randy, that is it. What you just shared is the shift that needs to happen across philanthropy, right? Because for so long, all the power was up here, but you just pushed it down, right? And so that is the shift that really has always been, particularly if I think about communities of color, probably every church in the city was built by people of color doing that, what you just talked about, right? And so I think those are the basic premises we just have to get back to. And honestly, that's still happening, and at the end of the day, the folks that we are here to serve, when you do not lose sight of that, then service happens, right? And so, and the money comes from the community. Now, what will happen now, according to the fact that we're having this conversation, is more and more of the foundations, because there's a handful that kind of, I'm learning this whole nonprofit world, there's a handful of foundations that kind of like, you know, most of the money that's given, the big dollars are held by just a handful of foundations, right? And then there's a level of, you know, well, we want our money to be used XYZ, you know, and you have to come this way and it has to be for this instead of operations. There's a whole thing that philanthropy money is only being used for operate or for particular projects instead of the operations of an organization, which is how the service actually happens for that nonprofit. That's a whole nother discussion, right? But at the end of the day, that spirit and that framework that you just described, it is happening. I believe that we just need to be paying attention more so that we continue that effort, because that is what makes the difference. The service to the folks that we are here to serve. I think about our nonprofit is here to serve emerging adults, but those young folks who are stepping into adulthood and they don't have all the resources needed in order to do that successful. And then when you don't, there's a lifelong impact, right? Well, you have to be unrelenting in executing that mission and working to find the donor dollars wherever they, you know, wherever you can find them, just from the perspective of there are always a grandmother or an aunt or, you know, that are willing to support because they know they've already adopted that person as their child and their son. And that same spirit still is here. I believe we just need to make sure that we're more intentional about ensuring that that's the message that's going across. And then the other question, or going back to Tom's original question of how do you truly begin to engage people of color if you're wanting them to be a part, or if you're wanting to have them be a part of your organization or from a philanthropy perspective, just as I mentioned about our emerging adults, you can sense and know if someone is authentic. You can see the angle before they even get there, right? And so it really is going to require people to be introspective about really what is it that you're trying to get at? What's your real goal? What's your real end game? Because they're going to sense that before you even get there. And then that's when it will shut down. And so I am excited simply because, one, there is a willingness. People are coming to me and others to ask the question, right? There just also needs to be the deeper conversation of the why. And I know Tom talks a lot about this in his classes. You know, I understand very clearly why I am here doing this work and what is happening in my life right now and what I am here to use my talents and skills to do. But also those things have to be done on an individual basis as well as at the organizational basis, because your motivation comes from that. And if it's off, it will be called out. I just know that, you know, my brothers and sisters, you know, they will call it out. And the other part is that there is still a willingness to reach out. And so even if there is a curt, you know, engagement, I wouldn't give up. You know, if your motivation is pure, don't give up. You know, come back again or ask, where can I get understanding? Because the stakes as far as the work is too important. And I think we should just remember that the work that we are really called to do is too important for us to walk away. So those are my couple of comments there.
All right, well, this is a great conversation. Just a reminder, we're at 9:30. We're going to go until 10 a.m. this morning. We're going to extend the session by 30 minutes. So we understand if you need to go, but we're going to go for another 30 minutes of discussion. We do have a question in the chat from Hannah Skiff. I think the question, and Hannah, feel free to jump in if I'm not getting it right, but I think that it's a question about how can nonprofits be more intentional about serving diverse communities, communities of color, as opposed to just being in those communities to raise money. I mean, it's really more about how to better serve them. So I don't know if anybody on the panel wants to talk more about that.
I was thinking of a few years, we've kind of not done much with COVID, but the Latina Giving Circle was very intentional with giving micro grants. So, you know, grants of about $5,000 or less to organizations that were serving the Latinx community in Kansas City. And it was very interesting when we would get a proposal from an organization, maybe they're national and they have local chapters, but they were pretty big and they were writing a proposal because they wanted to get, you know, a $5,000 grant for X, Y, and Z thing. And then when we always ask them, like, how is this serving specifically this community in Kansas City? We would always ask questions about like their board makeup and the leadership and all of those things. But really, we're like, how are you serving this community? And like, what does that look like? And how are you going to be able to report on that if we were to give you this grant? And it was always telling the organizations that really made an impact on the community versus the ones that didn't. And I always think back to, and I don't know if maybe because at the time of the grant I was pregnant, so I was extra, I thought about that a lot more, but there was at Samuel Rogers, we provided basically an ability for women that were needing to get a non-stress test completed. They didn't have to go to another clinic. They were able to stay there. And that chair and that machine is still in that center, regardless of whether or not it was a one-time 1-year grant and all these years later. And I know that it's really benefiting the community that it was intended to serve, rather than, you know, a picnic for, you know, this troop of Girl Scouts or something that isn't really going to make an impact. So I think that you really have to look at how, when you're serving the community, what is the impact that you're wanting to have? What's the longevity? What's almost that legacy that you're going to say like, oh, we're going to help root this thing that's really going to empower people. And I think that it's really the heart of it, is that you don't want to come in and, you know, save the day. It's like, what it's going to be something that's going to empower over time the community to become better, stronger, more able, you know, more able to do things on their own. And I always think back to that, you know, if a woman is going in and has to get this test done, is she gonna, you know, feel like, oh my gosh, I have to drive across town to go to this other hospital because it's not available at the clinic that I am seeing my doctor at? Or can I stay here? Can I do this? And is it gonna, you know, give me more of my, I don't know, say power back, but like you feel like you are not completely undone by something that's just something so simple. And I think those are the things, like, how are you wanting to impact people's lives? That is how I would perceive it and how I would view it, because you can give in a lot of really meaningful ways. I work in scholarships, and so the Community Foundation does so much in the community. Man, the number of grants that go out the door is amazing, but that 1% of dollars that are specifically going toward people's education, to me, I feel like I do the most important work there, because it is, you know, really impacting a person's daily life, and you're giving them a lot of power back. So I think that's just kind of what you have to think about, like, how are you wanting to serve the community that's going to help empower them in the future?
I agree with that. I just jump in. I think Rosisella said so many great things. That's why I love this panel, because I learned from my friends and colleagues, and she said it so well. But it's this sense of going in and working alongside a community instead of doing for. And then also looking at the reasons why there's that 60% of the people served by not-for-profits are communities of color or people of color, and the barriers and the systemic racism that has occurred that has made that the case. There's a reason why communities of color are have obstacles and barriers to access. and dismantling that is at the heart of it. And not this sense of, I loved how Tom at the top of the event said that he is, a white cisgender male and recognize that privilege. For individuals to recognize the privilege they have and utilize that to help dismantle these systems, right? And to rebuild them and look at these structures rather than saying the white savior complex that I know Tahir and I and many of us have talked about, this sense of, pitying a community instead of seeing the community as empowered individuals that need just someone to go alongside them to continue open doors of access. That's really the difference in mindset. And I've seen so many well-intending people, and even myself in different settings in the past where it may not have been communities of color, but other groups that I've thought, I want to help. But did I really want to help, or did I feel sorry for those individuals? And was that more reflecting on how I wanted to feel about myself? Or was it really trying to uplift communities the ways that I intended? So it's looking at your mindset and your actions, because Latasha said it, communities will sniff that out and see that insincerity so quickly and bristle. So when when development directors go to communities and they feel like they get this brick wall, you have to think about what these communities have endured and who has come to them, and do they know you and trust, and what might be the hesitancies, or what if there's microaggressions or terms, or if it's this thought that we aren't a community that can give and value. All of that plays out. And so it's that intentional relationship building, but cultural humility is at the very core of how organizations can build relationships with communities of color.
Nicole, I think she hit on so many noteworthy points. Two quick things would be language and resources. One, it's great to develop that strategy, but really take a moment to consider how you talk about these communities. Is it dignity-based or is it deficit-based? Latasha used a very nice way of saying, I think she said it was a curt engagement. Yes, you will have many quote unquote curt engagements. If you don't first take the time to just say, okay, board, staff, development team, diversity, define it. What's it mean to you? What's it mean for us? Okay, how are we defining community, right? Because we think we know it, but until you write it down and say it out loud, because that's happened so many times, ooh, that didn't come out the right way. Well, it's because you're waiting until you're in front of people you're trying to talk to say it for the first time. Practice saying it out loud, write it down. And don't just say it amongst your staff, especially if you're in a staff where you don't have people with lived experience, to Latasha's point, or you don't have people of color, you don't have people representing the community that you're trying to reach out to. See if you can bring people in who can do that. I know Nicole does that. She consults people on how to do this, but that's the first thing, is your language. How are you talking about people and communities? How are they seeing themselves or not seeing themselves? Then the second thing is resources. We're talking about giving back. A lot of times when we talk about giving back to other organizations, especially nonprofits and nonprofit, we immediately go to money. But there are a lot of resources that we might have that smaller organizations may not, or even organizations the same size, but they don't have the access. Maybe it is making a connection. Maybe it is some sort of shared workspace. There are a lot of things that we can do for one another that don't have to end with someone writing a check. I know we want to write that check, and hopefully we can get there and put that in the budget. But in the meantime, really take some inventory of what kind of access and resources you have that you can share and truly partner with someone. But make sure you have that language first, that part first, and then start taking evaluation of the resources you can share.
I'd like to touch on what Tahir said about it doesn't have to be dollars. So I'm in the business of affordable housing. And 2 years ago, one of our board presidents said, it doesn't have to be a check and it doesn't have to be money. Somebody could donate, plumbing supplies. We have a Sioux chief giving us all the plumbing supplies. We have to pay the labor, but they give the supplies. TAM Lumber giving lumber at 10% over costs. CFM giving heating and cooling equipment. And then we just have to pay for labor. And so those, like you said, those gifts or those donations are just as valuable in the work that I'm doing with housing as somebody writing the $1,000 check or the $2,000 check, whatever it is. But that's, you're right, that we can think of it differently. And I think right now is a time when we can think of jobs differently, we can think of flexibility different, and we can think of donations differently. And so, in the languaging, like you talk about the need for our communities, I think that we have to really start thinking about not using the word minority, because soon people of color will be majority. And so we really need to start looking at how do we language things so you're not saying, well, this is a minority community, you know, because it's soon will not be a minority community.
And I would just add one other additional thing, and this is on the side of education. You know, I feel like we all have an onus to educate ourselves, particularly if you are leading an organization that's serving a particular population, and that's not a population you came from, right? You want to spend some time educating yourself. And right now, I believe a lot of these things we're talking about, of course, are the systemic issues of our society. And I think it's going to be on us all, not just people of color, but everyone, to just educate yourselves. And I think one of the things we do for our board too is we have a carved out time where we just do education, right? And what I would recommend, and this is going to be a little bit outside the box, but there's a couple of documentaries that I think have just been significant, just as far as just like really explaining the history. One of them is about the years after Reconstruction by Henry Louis Gates. It's a PBS special. If you've not seen it, it's very complex and it's just brilliantly done. And it gives a comprehensive understanding of the history, right, of all the years after Reconstruction. The second one is, it's a Washington Post reporter. Her name is I think Brown, Miss Brown, I think. But it's the Tulsa and the Red Summer documentary. And those two, I feel like any organization that is doing any type of work, particularly for communities of color, I think it would just be beneficial for them to ground themselves in the history and the education of what the system that brought forth all of the things that we're dealing with right now. It is just imperative that we be equipped first with education, right? And then the second piece is each of us, there's what are we willing to give up? Like, in order for this to move forward in the way that really serves well the communities that we each are representing, we have to understand that there's always going to be something that we will have to give up, whether you're a white person, your privilege, or it's your understanding of the way the world has ran or the benefits and the incentives that have come your way. You have to be willing to understand and get grounded in the truth of that. And then for me as a person of color, you know, there was a hardening of the heart that happens when you have experienced the things that my ancestors have have experienced, right? And there's a shutting off that could happen, right? But then you have to push against that, right? Because the only reason why I'm here is a miracle, right? When I begin clearly understanding my ancestry, I am a miracle just to be here today, right? In the place that I am in. And that is only for those that are coming behind me. And I think all of us carry that. All of us have legacy behind us. That's the reason why you probably got on this call, is to gain understanding, because there's something in you that says that, you know, I want to be a part of something that changes and makes impact beyond my years. And so those are just a couple of things that I would recommend that we each do, particularly if you are leading organizations, because I think education of the history that really constructed these systems that we are really working to repair is imperative.
Well, Latasha, I'm so glad you are here. It's a blessing to have you as a friend and also on this panel. So I just always value what you have to say. So thank you for that. We're down to about 14 minutes, and Dr. Helm wants to make a few comments at the very end. But I guess I want to make sure there aren't any other questions from anyone or other comments from the panel. Erin is raising her hand. I also wanted to call out Mr. Robinson has made several really thoughtful comments in the chat. But Erin, if you'd like to go ahead, that'd be great.
So it's kind of a side note, and it's kind of off of what Gloria was saying. You know, she brought about the point that we use the term minority communities, and that's shifting. And unfortunately, I think as we see the shift, I don't think the shift in population and the shift in power will happen at the same time, unfortunately. So a term that comes to mind for me when I think of what we now refer to as minority communities, I think a better term is disempowered communities. And it's not a pretty term. It's an ugly term, really. But it brings to light what's happening and what needs to be addressed. So because as again, I think as populations grow, I don't know that we'll see power shift at the same time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just think what you're saying is 100% true. And I think in particularly about population growth among Hispanics and, you know, how, as Nicole said, how segregated communities are. And when we think about, you know, the population growth and what jobs they're in, I mean, yeah, we're talking about a lot of people who are disempowered, and they're not going to be, you know, we're not going to see the D'Angelo table look very different, probably, although I think we'll be making steady gains. But I think your point is well taken, and I love the term disempowered communities. It's an ugly term, but it certainly does speak to the reality.
Yeah, and I think the more we're willing to put truthful terms to situations, the more we're really willing to address and change the situations. Is kind of my thought. So if we can bring out the ugly, then and we have to come face to face with the ugly, then we have to create change. And so that's kind of my thought with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I often reflect on, you know, when I teach and talk about white privilege, the term privilege is such a off-putting word just to many, many people. And maybe there would have been a better word. I don't know, but it just feels like, you know, maybe that's an ugly term, but it certainly is the same kind of thing where a lot of white people, they think, well, I'm not privileged. My family wasn't privileged. We were impoverished. We rose because of our hard work. Well, you know, but you also were white, and that was a huge advantage over disempowered communities. And so that's just an important thing, I think, for people to understand. And so language is extremely important, as we've talked about. Any other questions? And I'm not looking at the chat, so if there's one there, Cindy, that you want to ask, please do. Okay. Any other, why don't we just take a moment to hear any final comments from the panelists, Tahir, Randy, Latasha, Nicole, and Rosisella. Any other final parting words before I turn it over to Dr. Helm?
I think I'm just wanting to say thank you. I am very honored to be a part of this conversation. And Tom, I'm really thankful for the relationship that we've been able to have over these years. I am really excited about the path forward as far as us as a community of nonprofits, but also just as a community of America. I mean, I know we have a lot of challenges, right? But I am excited, and I'm honored, and I'm also hopeful for what the days and the weeks and the months will be going forward, simply because of this. These opportunities for us to come together and be transparent, for us to really speak truth to things that have been painful, and to address things in a way that's not dismissive. We're breaking down walls now. And I am very excited and honored to be a part of this conversation. And I am looking forward to what is to come. And so thank you, Cindy, Mark, Tom, UMKC, for hosting this. and for my fellow panelists. I am learning every single day from you guys. And so I am so thankful for this. So thank you, Tom. I had to get that out there before everybody get off.
Also, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be able to be a part of this conversation every year. And one thing that, for what it's worth, imposter syndrome, I think, is very common in community, especially in communities of color, and sometimes in women as well. It's just a thing you're like, oh man, what am I gonna have to offer? And I'm so glad that I feel like I do. Like I think I can sit here and feel like, oh yeah, I have things to share, but also I'm learning so much. And I think it's just this ability to continue to learn and grow, but also just having the assurance that we have these seats at this table. And thank you so much for like allowing this conversation to happen and for people to continue to grow and learn and unlearn things that they need to, continue to do. So thanks for that.
I wanted to say this. So as Tom said at the beginning, I work for Jackson County CASA, right? And we're an organization constantly looking for volunteers, people who want to give their time, their money, support in any number of ways. What I would hope that comes out of this conversation isn't just someone taking a look at CASA, but taking a look at a lot of community organizations in the city. Even if you are a nonprofit yourself, I think on the development side, especially for younger people or people who haven't had a chance to get in there yet and really start to do that work. Latasha talked about earlier lived experience. I don't have the lived experience of the children that we serve. We serve children who have unfortunately had to deal with abuse or neglect and are in custody of the court, but we're hoping to reunify them, right, with their families or kinship, or to find some home where they can thrive. In that meantime, what I'm trying to do is make sure that I'm volunteering, that I'm connecting not just with those children, but with a number of communities around the city. So when you're talking about language and trying to get proximate to the problem, right, or to the needs that we're trying to serve in these marginalized and minoritized communities, 2 action steps for you. 1, if you're not volunteering or connected to a nonprofit, whether it's your own or others, consider doing that, right? The narrative that you're going to use in your development, in your ask is born out of that, right? So you don't have to do research and find someone else's story. Find your own story in the volunteer work that you might be engaged in already or that you can do. The second thing, and it's something I'm going to do after this, our CEO Angie's on the call, we'll have a conversation, is I need to get a lot more diligent about, again, the boards that are the companies represented on my own board and other organizations that I know, to again reach out to them. Let me talk to your business resource groups, your employee resource groups that focus on racial diversity and gender orientation and other marginalized communities. Let me talk to those groups so that we can find volunteers and donors, board members, staff members, et cetera. So those are the 2 things, right? Find your own story through the volunteer work you do, and then really try to plug into the networks you already have. Leverage those as much as you can.
I love everything Tahir said. Again, thank you so much for this opportunity, Tom. Thank you so much to Midwest Center. What I love about these conversations, and I saw some questions in the chat about this, is while I do this each semester with Tom, there's a ripple effect that happens. Just like Tahir has this, it's a catalyst to remind us and to give us some action steps. But what I try to remind people to do is a listen, learn, lead approach as well. Go in wherever space you're in and to listen and just to learn about people's lived experiences, because we aren't monolithic. And in those journeys and in those personal narratives, there's always nuggets that can help us to live out the mission that we're doing and to exemplify diversity, equity, inclusion. And then in terms of lead, I say in any space that you're in, and even though I'm in different spaces as a consultant, the place where I'm in the biggest leadership role is at the dining room table with my son. So remembering to teach and cultivate this new mindset of philanthropy that I heard Dacia, she put in the chat, it's a mindset, absolutely. How do you cultivate that in your spheres of influence? And so that's what I take away from the conversation today. Thank you. Great to see everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I'll just echo, I completely agree. Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Tom, and to everyone that participated today. Great conversation. And like others have said, this is an ongoing conversation, right? One thing I'll lift up that we didn't touch on a whole lot, but in addition to this conversation, is you know, as we continue to deal with and work through this pandemic, it's just as important now than ever. All of our organizations and communities have been so impacted, and the data shows our African American and Latino and marginalized communities have been impacted even more so, right? And so your organizations, the nonprofits that serve these communities, are so needed now, but you've also been impacted. And so how do we support and lift up each other and work together to make sure that those resources that are out there are coming to those communities that really need it, right? And to you all who are doing the day-to-day work. And so it's just as important now than ever to make sure that we're supporting and lifting each other up and making sure that we're working together to bring those resources where they're definitely needed. So just thank you so much to everybody, and I look forward to continuing doing the hard work that's needed every single day. So thank you.
All right, I want to say again, thank you to Tahir, Randy, Latasha, Nicole, Rosisella. I love you guys. Thank you for being in this with me. And really I want to say to all white people, be an ally, please be an ally. It's our job to solve this problem. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Helm for a few final comments.
So thank you, Tom. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to everyone participating. This is an important enough topic that it could stand alone, but I think it would be it's incumbent upon me to tell you that this is not standalone, actually. We are launching a new fundraising leadership program, and this is actually a part of that. It was built with the community members, and those community members said it's critically important that you have DEI interlaced throughout the entire fundraising leadership program. And so the session that Tom just hosted pairs with our first module, which will launch in October. It's a 6-module set, and that first module is Culture of Philanthropy. And you know, we believe this topic is part of Culture of Philanthropy. We have a module on strategy, and we will have another panel exactly like this that'll be 90 minutes that'll talk about importance of working DEI into your core organizational and philanthropy strategy. We'll have a module on financial leadership. We'll have another conversation around diversity, inclusion, and equity in our financial operations and how we think about those things. We'll have another one on talent management, another module on talent management. We'll have another panel like this, another conversation like this around DEI in our talent management processes. And then finally on communications, and the same thing there. And the reason this is so important is that we have so many blind spots and biases into because we are a product of our own heuristics. Unfortunately, we're humans and we're animals, and we have these we're pattern seeking, and we've developed, I've spent a lot of time in South Africa. And what South Africa did really good under Mandela was with the Truth and Reconciliation panels. What they said was that everyone's a victim of apartheid, right? There are obviously some people that are more than others, but the entire system made us sick. And I think that's and that's kind of the spirit behind all of our systems and our organizations suffer from the same blind spots and limitations, having grown up in this in the system that we live in today. And to really truly break them down, we have to systemically look throughout all of our behaviors and patterns. And so DEI is a core part of everything we'll do in this fundraising leadership program. We obviously would encourage and are excited for other people to join. We'll probably cap the first cohort at 20. It'll be a cohort program. We already are at about 11 or 12. Like I said, it starts in about a month. Cindy put up information on it. This is a part of that. So you don't have to be in the leadership program to participate in these, obviously, but they will build on what we're doing in those modules also. So if you have people in your development operation that you feel could use leadership training, this isn't how to write a grant. This isn't this is how do you be a leader from the development function in your organization as both maybe your most visual person in the community, but also a leader internally in helping develop the right culture, just culture, things along those lines. We believe very passionately in this. We'll continue to use our platform and our voice at the Midwest Center to raise the voices of people who know more and their voices aren't raised enough. This is an example of that, but it would have been remiss if I would not have had the opportunity to share with you the bigger picture of what this is a part of and our commitment to this space, not just now, but moving forward.
Okay, that concludes our session today. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next time. Take care.